The United States, over the years of 1967 to 1972, would go on to launch a full-scale, top-secret program to modify the weather in Southeast Asia. This was done to give the US military the advantage during the Vietnam War. You might be wondering, is this just some crazy conspiracy? To that I will say, no. This is completely real. The government for 5 years, and for possibly much longer, chemically manipulated the atmosphere to turn the weather in our favor to help the war effort. This is Operation Popeye. In order to talk about this topic, we need to firstly discuss the history behind the idea, because it extends way farther back than just the Vietnam War, and has been generally in the mind of many scientists in the United States and the world for a very, very long time. Enter Edward Powers. He's a very obscure figure in history, so much so that he doesn't even have a photo, nor an official Wikipedia, but his book War and Weather is what's most interesting. It essentially describes several military engagements in which the military, intentional or not, through different means, manipulated the weather and caused rain. On page 46, he describes an engagement on Morris Island, where on the first day, the skies were clear and cloudless. But after a heavy bombardment of artillery fire and a general assault on the beach, the following day, it was overcast. Of course, weather can change at the flip of a dime, but it isn't just this example. The entire book is filled with examples of heavy artillery fire or bullets entering the atmosphere, and then, suddenly, rain occurring the following day or even on the same day. His book probably contributed to the later practice of geoengineering. That's where Operation Popeye comes in. In order to ensure an American victory, the US government essentially tried to play God. Preliminary test of Operation Popeye went underway in 1966 under President Lyndon B. Johnson. According to declassified notes by Lieutenant Colonel Ed Sawyer, he wrote,
"The close monitoring of troop and truck traffic along routes where rain had fallen verified beyond any doubt the natural adverse effects of rainfall and accumulated soil moisture on the enemy's logistic effort."
Rain was closely monitored as it tended to guide the US military to the enemy's movements. Vietnam was a classic example of guerrilla warfare, and the US military really struggled in combat because of it. We've all heard the stories, the bamboo traps, supply lines that were pretty much invisible to the naked eye, and sporadic troop movements among the Viet Cong. Rain in general just made it harder to traverse. The roads got wet, it was harder to move jeeps or trucks around there. The jungle was much harder to climb through and see through. Heavy humidity causes large amounts of disease, infections, you name it. Without a strong central force or an excess of resources, a guerrilla army is only as strong as its circumstances. It was a safe bet for the military to theorize that this heavily affected the rate at which the Viet Cong got their supplies. Operation Popeye was meant to ruin roads, jam rivers, and pretty much extend the amount of time Vietnam was untraversable by foot. The US military, better equipped for this kind of weather through air superiority, would in theory have a field day, and the war could be fought in the air instead of the ground. Let's switch topics for a bit and discuss the main weather manipulation tactic the US military actually used: cloud seeding. It essentially is a type of modification method that aims to change or essentially control the amount of precipitation, hail, or even fog is let out by clouds. The practice is theorized to have begun in 1943 by Vincent Schaefer, an employee of General Electric. His work at this time centered around precipitation static, aircraft icing, ice nuclei, and cloud physics. In the summer of 1946, Vincent found his experimental cold box a bit too warm for his experiments. He then switched to dry ice. This time, the temperature was so cold that every time that he spoke or breathed, there would be mini mist, or a mini cloud. While that phenomenon is known and it's pretty common, I mean, you see it on your cold, what wasn't was the blue haze that suddenly turned into millions of tiny microscopic ice crystals. He realized the sudden change in heat/cold, humidity, and supercooled water, if all done at the right time, can instantly produce billions of ice nuclei. Testing out his theory on a natural cloud in November of the same year, it actually worked, and he successfully changed the weather of a cloud. While his general experiments were heavily scrutinized but found to actually have merit by the scientific community, morally, it was not popular. And to this day, the greater scientific community generally is apprehensive whenever practicing or covering this subject. As you are going to see later, cloud seeding was a giant stepping stone in the wider conspiracy theory of geoengineering. Either way, Vincent Schaefer invented a method in which you can manipulate a cloud to your own liking by blasting some specific chemicals into clouds. He used dry ice and another type of molecule, but what the United States government did was very different, and I would say a bit more unnatural. It wasn't until 1967 where the operational phase of Operation Popeye began, I know, hilarious, and a different form of cloud seeding appeared. Instead of dry ice or super cool material being used to seed the clouds, it would be silver or lead iodine, a compound mixture that to at least the US government was far more effective than ice. These two compounds were essentially primary sources of water condensation nuclei, and they thought a more heavy concentration of that would probably serve better than the other materials they were using, as they weren't as concentrated. The plane crew and pilots would light the canisters filled with the compound and release the particle-rich smoke into an already existing storm or patch of rain. If things went to plan, the jolt of artificial nuclei would forcibly create additional rain and continue the already existing rainfall. Now, were the effects of the cloud seeding program and Operation Popeye as a whole successful? Yes and no. Some sources claim that it was a relative success, as from September of 1967 to July of 1972, the monsoon period was extended in Vietnam by 30 to 45 days. The effects on the Viet Cong can only be speculated on, but it must have been a very rough couple of weeks. Other sources, however, claim that while yes, it was successful in technical terms, the amount of money spent on the project far outweighed the quote-unquote positive effects it had on the war effort. It apparently costed about $3.6 million to run the program for a year. Adjusted to 2024 inflation, that would be $28 million a year. The entire operation costed well over $100 million for just a couple of weeks of reported extra rain. Either way, in 1971, an American newspaper columnist named Jack Anderson broke the story concerning Operation Popeye. Just imagine, you're a US citizen and you're actively hearing and seeing the Vietnam War happen in real time. This is one of the first ever televised wars. And then as you're going to work, probably feeling a tinge of anxiety, you see this newspaper column.
Air Force rainmakers operating secretly in the skies over the Ho Chi Minh Trail have succeeded in turning the weather against the North Vietnamese. These strange weather warriors seed the clouds during the monsoons in an attempt to concentrate more rainfall on the trails and wash them out. There are monthly reports stamped top secret, and they have claimed relative success in creating man-made cloudburst over the trail complex. These assertedly have caused flooding conditions along the trail, making them impassable. The same cloudbursts that have flooded the Ho Chi Minh Trail reportedly also have washed out some Laotian villages. This is the reason, presumably, that the Air Force has kept its weather-making triumphs in Indochina so secret.
Just a year later, the New York Times published an official article chronicling the entire military operation from its known start to its current form, exposing the secrecy behind the project. The operation, coincidentally, ended 2 days after the publication of the article. This wasn't the end for Popeye though, as in 1974, a top-secret meeting was held to discuss the operation's far-reaching implications and its general moral questions it brings up. Claire Bumpel, a Democratic senator from Rhode Island, and Clifford, a Republican from New Jersey, attended the meeting and were given access to the official classified papers. Thankfully, we have a bit from those papers, but I suspect that even if it says it's declassified, there is still a lot of information that we still have no idea about. So, taking a glance through the document, the target of the monsoons were directly supposed to affect supply lines. That was the entire goal. Southeast Asia had two distinct weathers: Northeast monsoon season and Southeast monsoon season. Northeast can be characterized as very light. The rainfall was next to non-existent, making the region dry, and the roads perfect for the Viet Cong to supply their lines. You could probably guess, but on the polar opposite side is the Southwest monsoon season. This time, everything was heavy with rainfall, with storms and casual showers occurring daily, leading to, predictably, a horrible time for transporting materials and traversing the jungle for the Viet Cong. Of course, like I mentioned before, this is great for the US. They had better helicopters and better vehicles to deal with the rain. This was a vital time to gauge the Viet Cong's strength and weaken already existing encampments or attack vital supply lines. In order to maximize and produce the most favorable effects through seeding, the process had to be done perfectly. The document goes on to explain the science and the method the pilots had to use in order to take full advantage of the chemicals. Pilots would have to locate updrafts in the clouds, releasing small amounts of seeding material into said updrafts. The agent inside of the canisters caused supercooled drops to freeze, releasing heat or energy, and a more rapid condensation of water vapor on the frozen drops than is possible with the liquid drops. This minuscule change causes the updraft of the cloud to increase its velocity, subsequently sucking in more moisture from the air, causing more frequent condensation, and eventually precipitation. Further down in the document, we get to see authorized areas of operation. Firstly, they targeted Laos and a very small portion of North Vietnam. Further on, they began to expand around those borders, further encroaching up north. However, by 1972, northern encroachment slowed, but to the south, it was picking up at a greater pace, with it reaching Cambodia and almost Vietnam itself. From 1967 to 1972, 2,602 sorties were flown, and 47,409 units of chemicals were just airdropped over the land. In the papers, it is directly acknowledged that in order for this operation to continue in full capacity, it needed presidential approval. Remember, Commander-in-Chief. This means the Nixon administration, as well as the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, either lied to Congress or Congress knew about this operation but chose not to say anything to the media, and subsequently journalists found their dirty little secret. To avoid a shitstorm in the public eye, as already the US government's reputation was on the brink of collapse due to the Vietnam War itself, the Pentagon chose to drip feed information, giving the public just enough for them to be happy while still not heavily incriminating themselves. They made it so this entire case was in the background, something that didn't really do anything, it was just tiny, and it seemed to have worked. Whether this is because Operation Popeye pales in comparison to the other conspiracy theories that surrounds the Vietnam War, one cannot say. But to this day, you look like a crazy person when you say the government controls the weather, when that is what happened for years in Vietnam. They have full capability to do so. There is even a phrase that was supposedly used by insiders of the project: make mud, not war. Because the US government realized mud is the biggest enemy to an army that can't fly. It's a little disappointing, but not much was done after Popeye to persecute or hold higher-up officials accountable. No one faced the music. The US government could have caused some humanitarian or ecological damage to Southeast Asia. In fact, another chemical compound used during the war, Agent Orange, still has an effect on the birth rates of Vietnam to this day. If the project was never uncovered, or if their relative success continued, who knows the amount of damage that could have been done. It is interesting to note, however, that Operation Popeye and the act of weather manipulation is still going strong in other parts of the world, and in the US, we still do it, probably more now. A lot of private companies and even environmental agencies occasionally seed clouds for increased rain during droughts, or maybe to revitalize a dead ecosystem, or as a way to increase tourism with increasing in snow or decrease in rain. Summertime seeding has been occurring annually for years now, and even countries like Mumbai and the Emirates periodically practice cloud seeding with, from what I see, the exact same method that was used in Vietnam, just slightly more streamlined because it's the modern day. These global efforts reportedly create billions of tons of rain each year, coming at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. While international conventions prevent the use of weather manipulation during wartime or as a form of leverage against opposing nations, I don't think that's going to be followed or has been followed at all. Look at it logically. It took the American public almost a decade to get an inkling of what the US was doing, and to this day there is still ongoing speculation that weather manipulation is still being weaponized in other ways, being used in warfare to some capacity. It's very hard to monitor them since planes and helicopters in the sky are all but normal now, and this type of seeding is also probably done privately or contracted by the United States to keep their hands clean of any mess. It's invisible. It's a part of life now at this point, and unless you have a fucking $1 million satellite or a stratosphere plane or whatever the one they're using in NASA, I highly doubt any of us are going to be seeing it anytime soon. To cap off, most, if not all, of the major contributors behind Operation Popeye are to this day unknown, apart from some generals or officials who decided to comment on the program or were mentioned briefly in the document. But as much as I want to uncover a rabbit hole, these names led to nowhere. It's a super useful piece of information, don't get me wrong. Its research is very detailed, but it's surprisingly brief, and it isn't a full rundown of the operation. If you've ever read any declassified military document that was posted on War Thunder, or even perused WikiLeaks or other sites of that nature, you would know that these types of documents have hundreds of pages that go into each and every one of these little details that these operations usually operate under. But it's clear that Operation Popeye just either died at its infancy, or most, if not all of the information, died with its creators. That's the nature of time, I guess. Maybe one day in the very, very, very far future, we'll find out the truth. Hello, this is Live Seb. Yes, thanks for the support on the last video, and if you want to see more live action stuff like this, then, I don't know, I'll do something. I'm not making any money on this channel. So, yeah, thanks. Here's my mug. Anyway, yeah, thanks. See you guys in the next video. Probably in the next year, month.